The great thing about small hatchets over large axes is that they are portable. You can often carry some of the smaller ones on your belt. The issue I've found with having them tucked into your belt is that they can really restrict movement. You can eliminate this by using a simple piece of paracord. Take a piece of the cord, bring the ends together and tie them in a knot. This creates a loop. Now pass this loop through your belt and then pass the knot through the loop like you would with a prusik knot for tying onto the ridgeline of a tarp. Pull the knot tight and you have yourself a small loop dangling from your belt. Now you can pass the handle of your hatchet through this loop and it will sit close to your hip, but not too tight that it restricts your movement. Whenever you go to kneel down, the axe moves freely. It's also dead easy to deploy whenever you need to use it. Once you're done, just loosen the loop and pull it free from your belt. You can keep this piece of cordage in your kit, ready to deploy whenever you need to use it. It doesn't have to be used for just hatchets too. I've also used it for carrying a water bottle on me. Despite being dead for years, the roots of a pine tree are one of the last things to decompose. When a pine tree has broken branches, it tends to send this resin to these affected areas to prevent bugs and bacteria from causing disease to the tree. When a tree is blown over in a storm, it sends the resin to the root system. This provides a valuable resource for firelighting. Cut off a root as close to the base of the stump as possible. You'll know you've struck gold when you see the dark red resinous area on the open end of the cut. These natural oils are what make it that colour, and they are very flammable. Take your knife and strip off the outer bark of the root. Whilst this can still burn, it's the resinous layer beneath it that you really need. Use the back of your knife to scrape off fine shavings of the resinous wood. If your knife doesn't have a sharp spine, you can use the blade, but over time you'll want to sharpen your knife edge, as doing this often will start to dull your blade. Now use your fire steel to scrape off some sparks into the fine resin shavings, and they will readily ignite. They burn for a considerable amount of time, allowing you a bit more freedom to place fine twigs on top and begin to grow your fire. The great thing about using this resin to light a fire is that it burns well even in wet weather. You'll notice black smoke emitting from the flame, and this is the flammable oils burning off from the resin. You can keep the stick in your firelighting kit ready to be used again in the future. Given that you only need a small amount of shavings to get a flame, it should last you a considerable amount of time. As a result of spending a lot of time outdoors in wet weather, I have adapted my Bushcraft kit to help me get the best chance of getting a fire going in any conditions. Lately, I've kept a simple 1 metre square piece of waxed canvas in my kit. The first, and arguably the most important part of wet weather firelighting, is to try and find the driest wood. To do this, look for dead branches that are high up off the ground. Branches like these Scots pine ones are ideal, as there is plenty of resin that builds up in the joint where the branch meets the tree. Picking sticks up that are directly on the ground is not really ideal, as much of the moisture from the ground will seep into the wood and it will take longer to dry out. That's not to say you can't get a fire going with it, it just means that you will need to spend more time processing it down to make a viable piece of kindling. Whilst this particular branch here looks like it has ideal twigs for kindling, they will have sucked up the moisture from the forest floor and will remain wet for a few days. It's best to choose twigs that are high and dry and about the thickness of a pencil. To check whether a stick is dry enough, it should snap cleanly as it breaks. If it snaps, but pieces of bark still hold on, then this wood is still green, i.e. it has not been dead long enough for all of the moisture to have left the wood. This type of wood will still ignite in a fire, but only when a fire has been burning for hot and long enough for it to do so. It's not ideal for the beginning stage of firelighting. As I know the weather is changeable fast here in the UK, this is where the waxed canvas sheet comes in handy. I place my twigs and kindling on top of the mat, and this stops any moisture from the ground seeping up into the wood as I go to collect more material. The best natural firelighting resource that is available to me in this area is by far the bark of the silver birch tree. Here is a small piece I collected earlier that day, and to show you how flammable it is, I'm going to soak it in this small body of water and ignite it. After shaking off the excess water, you can see that the bark is still completely saturated. and if I hold a lighter to it, just watch how quickly it takes to flame once that initial surface layer of water has evaporated. The reason why it burns so well is because the outer bark contains betulin, which is what causes the bark to be white, but also protects the tree from bugs, pests and disease. The betulin is highly flammable, and it will often produce a black smoke as the oils burn off when you first light it. Whenever I see silver birch when I'm camping or out in the woods, I will always try and keep a small piece in my pack to stay dry for when I next need it for firelighting. But what if you don't have birch bark near you? Well, you can still get a fire going, you just need to use a different method. Remember when I spoke about not using damp sticks from the forest floor? Well, sometimes you might have no other option. In this case, find the driest part of the wood and cut out a small section that is free of any knots or side branches. Ideally, it needs to be as straight as possible. Here you can clearly see these two pieces of wood I have cut are wet on the outside, but on the inside they're relatively dry. If we can expose this dry wood, then we'll have a much better chance of success for our fire. I split the wood in half by using my knife and another stick as a batten. Once it's split open, the wood is nice and white, which means it's dry. So despite the fact that wood looks wet on the outside, the bark is actually what keeps the inner wood dry. All that is needed is to expose that dry inner wood. Now, using my knife, I make fine curls towards the bottom of the stick. These need to be as thin as possible, but not too thin that they fall off the stick. By doing this, I'm getting to the innermost part of the wood, which will be the driest. Once I've made a big enough feather stick, I tend to make a number of very small thin shavings with the tip of my knife. You don't have to do this step, but again, given that the wood is wet, it's offering the best chance possible to get that fire going. I don't tend to cut any corners when lighting fire with wet wood. I then lay a few sticks down to act as a raft and keep my fire off the ground. Fire needs heat to continue burning. If I tried to light the feather sticks directly on the ground, the cold from the saturated moss is going to sap the heat from the fire and likely stop it from burning well. I keep a small fire steel in my kit at all times. I lay my fire steel on the stick so that it is directly opposite those fine shavings that I just made. I then shower it with a few sparks, the fine curls ignite first, and then I tilt the feather stick vertically so that the fire climbs up through the curls. You don't have much time before the fire starts burning through the wood, and so I place a second feather stick on top to grow the flame. Ideally, a third feather stick will give you a more efficient burn. Then it's just a case of laying the feather stick down onto the layer of sticks and slowly adding small pieces of kindling on top and gently building the fire up as it burns. The Polish Lavu is one of my favourite pieces of kit. It's essentially two military ponchos that are buttoned together, and they can be quickly deployed into a two-person tent just by adding a centre pole. They are made from canvas, which means they are really durable, but they're also on the heavy side. The ability to wear them as a poncho to protect you from the elements, and then quickly deploy them into a tent, makes them a versatile piece of kit to have. I've used mine in all sorts of conditions, including a multi-day winter snow camping trip. The armholes allow you to put a stovepipe through them, and if you have a collapsible stove, this adds to the compactness of this entire setup. I find canvas to be a great material for a tent. Despite it being heavy, it keeps you warm in the winter and cool in the summer. However, I would advise that you get some fire protective material to go around the arm sleeves if you are using a wood stove in there. Fire and canvas do not mix well. One of the most underrated items in my kit is a tube of porta wipes. This little tube contains 10 compressed tissues. And by compressed, I mean seriously compressed. Each tissue is about the diameter of a £1 coin. All you need to do is to add water to them and watch them expand into a pretty durable wipe, which you can use for cleaning your hands, washing your face, or even to help wipe excess blood off superficial wounds, providing you use sterile water of course. They don't break up like normal tissues would. They are more of a wet wipe. It does say that they are biodegradable, but I still take them home to dispose of. They're an awesome piece of kit, even if you're just into camping and hiking and not the hardcore bushcraft and survival stuff. I find them really useful. I'm not sponsored by them. In fact, I was sent them by a subscriber years ago. I just genuinely use them regularly. Another small item that I keep in my pack at all times is a lightweight tarp. This one is a 3x3 meter one by DD. I'll link to it below, but any tarp can be used to make shelter. I just opt for one that is very compact and small. If I know conditions are going to be wet, then often I will stuff my tarp in one of the side pockets of my backpack. This is where having a lightweight thin tarp is useful. At one end of the tarp I will have some cordage tied to it, and this will be the last part that I put into the pocket of the pack. This side pouch is just over a litre, and the 3x3 meter tarp fits snug and the zip can be done up. And now we wait for the rain. Many times I've been out in the woods and the weather has caught me off guard. The forecast has said no rain, but I've suddenly been hit by a downpour and had little time to get under cover. This is why I have honed some of my kit so that I'm fully prepared for this. If you haven't checked the weather before you've gone out on a trip, you can often tell when bad weather is about to hit. Signs I look out for is a sudden drop in temperature, the air feels cool and fresh, and the wind will start to pick up. And whilst this might feel nice when you have been cutting up firewood, get ready, as you won't have long before the rain arrives. This is a weather front, and depending on the strength of the wind, you need to be ready to deploy a shelter quickly. And this is where my favourite tarp shelter comes in. Find a tree, any tree will do, but preferably one that is sturdy. I pull the cordage out of the pocket and tie this corner of the tarp to the tree. I try and tie it as high as I can, as 3 meters will offer quite a bit of shelter, and the higher I tie this corner of the tarp, the steeper the angle will be to shed water. However, if you want more space underneath your shelter, then tie it around head height. Now I just use the weight of the backpack to pull out the remainder of the tarp. By keeping it inside the pocket like this, not only does it allow for quick deployment, but it also means that the tarp doesn't blow and flap around everywhere in strong winds. Now it's just a case of pegging out each tie-up point of the tarp, trying to keep the material as tight as possible. I can set this tarp shelter up in less than 3 minutes and have all my gear in the dry. To stop the kindling I have collected earlier from getting wet again, I just roll the wax canvas sheet across it and it keeps the rain off. Alternatively, I could put the kindling under my tarp, but then the ground under the tarp is already damp. With the firewood prepped and sorted and the gear dry, I then make some final adjustments to the tarp. You can see that even in this heavy rain, the water just runs off this waxed canvas sheet. I decided to leave it outside to see how dry it would keep the wood. As I said earlier, the best natural material for fire lighting in this area is silver birch bark, and so I use my knife to scrape the outer bark into a fine dust pile. Just underneath the outer white layer is where the flammable oils of the bark are. Now I'm under the tarp, I can take my time getting the final preparations of the fire ready. The ground in this particular area is saturated all year round. It's basically a bog, which is another reason I chose it for this episode. Despite the fact I don't really need to clear an area for a fire because the ground is so wet, I still think it's good practice to do this, as I want to be able to leave no trace of fire once I pack up camp. As I demonstrated earlier, I create a raft using small sticks. If you want to increase your chance of fire, you can split slightly larger sticks in half to create a flat, dry area to build your fire on. Now I use that waxed canvas sheet to protect the birch bark from the rain. It's imperative that the birch bark powder is kept as dry as possible. It will still ignite when wet, but it will take longer to burn the more saturated it is. Once the dust pile ignites, you have a few seconds to keep the fire going. To do this, I peel off a number of thin strips of the birch bark and get this lit from that first flame. It can take a while, but relying on the dust pile alone to get your twigs ignited isn't enough. You need to get that flame going for an extended period of time, and to do that, I carry it over to small strips of bark. Once these small strips have a more established flame, then I lay the twigs down on top of it. You'll notice that I place the horizontal stick underneath the twigs before I lay them down. This is so that I can raise and lower the twigs to allow more oxygen to help the flame catch the alight. Throughout the early stages of the fire, I keep my body hunched over it to try and keep the rain off. With the rain being so heavy, it could easily put the flame out. And here's a top tip. I won't put the next layer of sticks on until the flame rises above the previous layer of sticks. And I apply this to all of my fire lighting in both dry and wet conditions. Too many times over the years, I've put a fire out by putting on too much fuel too early and smothering it. When a fire is only just going, I find it best to let the flame creep above the first layer of sticks before adding the next layer. This allows the heat to build up at the base of the fire, as well as allowing more oxygen in. Once the flame is well established, then I don't have to hunch over it anymore, as the heat at the base of the fire is enough that providing I keep adding fuel to it, it won't go out. If your fire is still struggling at this point, then it doesn't hurt to add more oxygen by blowing into the fire. You only really need to do this at the beginning stages, or at least until you have enough of a roaring flame. And now you can relax and enjoy some time in the woods. This particular woodland is damp all year round. This is evident from the dense patches of moss that are spread throughout. Trying to find dry tinder in environments like this can often be quite tricky. However, despite the ground being soaking wet, there is still a natural material that grows amongst it that can be made into a usable tinder once it has been prepared well enough. You'll notice the white blades of grass growing amongst the moss. If you focus on collecting the thin, broad blades of grass, these are often the driest. Gather a good handful of grass and rub it between your hands. After a few minutes, the heat that builds up between your hands will start to dry out the grass. If you continue to rip and break the fibres in between buffing it between your hands, it will help to make the tinder more fluffy, which is what you need for it to catch a spark from a fire steel or an ember from a bow drill. Continue to collect the grass, as more often than not, you need double the amount you think you need. Here is a quick tinder bundle made in around 5 minutes from picking up the wet grass. You'll see it is compact and it looks like a small bird's nest. And now, just a few sparks from a ferro rod will help the tinder bundle to ignite. As the grass is quite damp, you'll need to add oxygen to help encourage it into a stronger flame. Maintaining a campfire can sometimes be an arduous task, especially during the earlier stages when you need to constantly keep feeding sticks in the fire until it gets hot enough to create coals. One of the ways to create a low maintenance fire is by building it upside down. By that I mean start by sawing off a few lengths of large dry logs. The thicker and longer the log that you cut, the bigger your fire will be. For this example, I'm cutting a length of around 40 centimeters and roughly 10 centimeters in diameter. In layman's terms, that's basically a log the length of my forearm. The species of wood that I am using here is ash, which burns well on a campfire. The important thing to remember is to choose the driest wood possible. Next, I cut a load of smaller sized logs to the same length. I then use my axe to split some of these smaller logs in half to expose the dry inner wood. And now for the fun part. I start by building the fire upside down. First I lay down the thickest logs, then I lay the thinner ones perpendicular to the ones below. On top of those I lay the split logs with the exposed wood facing upwards. I continue to build the fire lay until all of the split logs are used. It's kind of like making a Jenga tower. At the top of the fire I lay small dry twigs. Now all you need to do is light a fire on top and watch as the magic happens. This time I decided to light the fire with a traditional flint and steel method. I strike the steel down onto the sharp piece of flint, which causes sparks to catch onto the char cloth. I then place the char cloth into the tinder bundle, which is the bark of the honeysuckle vine. I blow some air into the tinder bundle to force oxygen in, and then the fire ignites. I add a few thin strips of silver birch bark, which will help to extend the flame. Then I just add a few twigs to build the initial flame up, and I can sit back and let the fire burn. There is no need to go and hunt for more firewood to keep adding to the fire. Each layer burns and then the coals drop onto the layer below, which allows the fire to continue burning. Here is what the fire looks like after 30 minutes. It's burning with a hot, clean flame. And here is what it's like after 1 hour. And finally, Here is the fire after an hour and a half. I have not had to add any sticks to the fire in this time. These coals would be great for cooking on. So, whilst the initial part of collecting the firewood takes a bit of time, once the fire gets going, it requires very little maintenance. The fire would have probably burned for longer if it wasn't such a windy day. Whilst this fire is burning, let's take a look at a method you can use to boil some water over it. I cut 3 sticks to equal length. Then I lay the sticks next to each other and secure them with some bank line. The knot I use to secure them is an arbor knot. Once the arbor knot is cinched tight, I take a number of wraps of the cordage around the sticks. Normally 3 wraps does it. Then I do some vertical wraps that weave in between the sticks and over the horizontal cordage. These are known as fraps, and these help tighten the whole lashing. Again, I do these about 3 times in between each gap. With the knot secure, I can lift up the sticks and form a tripod. The lashing will tighten as I splay the legs out. You'll notice I have deliberately left a length of bank line. At the end of this line, I'm going to tie a marlin spike hitch. It's a dead easy knot. Apologies for the out of focus shot here, but you can still see how it's tied. First, I make a loop in the end of the line. Then I bring that loop up to the centre line above it to form another loop. I then pass a stick through the loop and behind the centre line. Then I cinch the knot tight against the stick. Now I can pass this stick through the bail arm of a billy can, and it allows me to hang the billy can directly above the fire. The cord will spin for a few minutes as it's been twisted up where it has been stored in my backpack. To get the billy can closer to the heat of the fire, I just widen the tripod legs. A benefit of this type of fire lighting is that it's reusable. Much like a fire steel can be reused over and over again. The steel striker will give you thousands of sparks before it starts to fail you. The flint, on the other hand, will start to lose its sharpness after just a few uses. You can make your own flint shard fairly easily. Here is a piece of flint I found in the woods. It already has a fairly sharp edge where it's broken off from another larger piece, and it can still throw off some sparks. However, if you use a larger stone and strike the flint in a downward motion, you can often crack off smaller shards of flint which are far sharper. The inner pieces of the flint have sharp edges. This will throw out good amounts of sparks before they dull. And now that one large piece of flint has been broken into multiple usable pieces which you can stow away in your fire lighting kit for later use. A more modern backup emergency fire lighting technique is the inner tube of a bicycle tyre. This small piece keeps the lid secure on my flint and steel kit. If I am in real need of lighting a fire quickly, especially in adverse conditions like strong winds and rain, I can cut off a thin strip of the inner tube, and then tie this into a knot and hold a lighter to it for a few seconds. Being rubber, it burns really well, and allows enough time to burn through damp kindling. As it burns for a while, you only really need a small amount to build up a fire. The smoke it gives off is toxic, so I would only use this method of fire lighting in an emergency, but it is a great backup option to have. Some knives don't have a sharp 90-degree spine. For example, this Halterfor's knife here wasn't manufactured with a 90-degree spine, which means when I go to use it on a fire steel, it really struggles to get sparks from it, and I have to apply a lot of pressure and effort to generate these sparks. If your knife doesn't have a 90-degree spine, it's okay, as with any bushcraft knife, there is an area on the tip of the blade where the 2 sides of the grind meet. This will usually have a sharp 90-degree angle, which you can then use to get sparks from the ferro rod. You don't have much room to manoeuvre like you would when you can use the whole length of the spine of the knife, but if you get the angle right, you can generate a large amount of sparks in a concentrated area. If you worry about using your knife on a fire steel, and your fire steel doesn't come with a striker attached, then you do have another option. The spine of many saw blades will have a 90-degree angle on it. For example, this folding handsaw here has a sharp edge on the back of the blade. This can be used exactly like a striker, and in my opinion, you can produce more sparks using the back of the saw blade than you can with the little flat strikers. Most fire steels come with a hole in the handle or the rod for you to tie some cord to, so why not tie something bright to it? That way, if you do end up dropping it on the forest floor, the cordage stands out against the leaves and debris, making it much easier to catch your eye. Alternatively, you could add some fire lighting paracord to the handle. This paracord has some waterproof flax fire cord inside, which is flammable. That way, if you find yourself needing to light a fire and you don't have much tinder available, you can undo the paracord from your fire steel and pull out a length of the flax fire cord. Then scrunch this up in a ball and throw some sparks on it with the fire steel. It lights pretty quickly and burns with enough time for you to add some fine twigs and kindling and build up your fire. The majority of tarps will generally have at least 4 tie-up points. The first tip is that I make sure to always have guy lines tied out on at least 4 corners of my tarp. These will stay on my tarp all year round. Most of my shelter setups can be made with just these 4 tie-out points, but sometimes I need to add 1 or 2 extra guy lines. The tarp I use is a square tarp, normally 3 by 3 meters, but with this ultralight one it's actually 2.9 by 3 meters, so near enough a square shape. Before I show you the shelters, it's worth mentioning that I now tend to keep my tarp stuffed in the side pocket of my backpack instead of a separate dry bag. That way I can quickly deploy the tarp in strong winds, as the backpack keeps the tarp from flapping around when trying to peg it out or hang it from a tree. I normally tie the last tie-up point to the zip of my bag so that it never blows away. To make it easier for you guys to see, I'm going to set the first shelter up by laying it out in a square. I normally have about 2.5 to 3 meters of cordage on my guy lines. On this particular tarp, I have used bank line, but I also use 550 paracord. If you want to set up your tarp in the quickest way possible, then it's better to bring some strong metal tent stakes with you. However, to save on weight and space in the pack, I tend to make my own, unless I am heading to an area of open land where there are very few trees. I look for thin sticks that have a number of broken branches and knots coming off them. This particular woodland is dense, with Scots pine being the predominant species. As it's dense, the trees are growing close together, and as a result, they grow really straight. This makes it ideal for quickly whittling up some stakes. Snap or saw the branches just above the knots. This small stick produced 7 stakes. These protruding branches act as a hook to stop your guy lines from falling off the stakes when you peg them out. Using a knife, I then put some points onto the ends of the stakes. For the first shelter, peg out the 4 corners of the tarp. Once all corners are pegged out, it pins the tarp to the ground and the wind shouldn't pull it up. From there, I then peg out the 2 tie-up points that are right next to the corner tie-ups. As each peg goes in, I pull the tarp diagonally so that there is tension between each peg. I do this to the 2 far corners of the tarp. This is going to be the back of the shelter, so ideally have the back facing the wind. That way the wind will blow up and over the shelter and not directly inside it where you are likely to be sleeping. I unpeg the 2 back corners of the tarp and tuck them underneath. The eagle-eyed among you might notice that I also have a guy line tied to the centre tie-up point of the tarp. This gets used in a different shelter which I will show you later on in the video. Now I come to the front of the tarp. I take the corner that was staked out and unpeg it. I find the next tie-up point along from it and add about 6 inches, then I flip the corner tie-up point to here and peg it in. I do the exact same thing to the other side. Find the next tie-up point from the corner, add a few inches, and then flip the corner in and peg it out. This will be the front of the shelter. Next up, I cut a branch about the thickness of my wrist. I use my bushcraft knife to bevel one end of the stick. This end is going to push up against the tarp, so it's best to make the end as smooth as possible. I leave the other end flat. Then I take my stick and place it underneath the centre of the tarp, making sure it is as straight as possible. This is where the beveled end of the stick needs to be facing the tarp material. You can add a shamag or a spare sock to the tip of the stick to stop it from piercing the tarp if you wish, but I've never had a problem by just beveling it. Now you don't have to do this next step, but I find it does help to make the tarp have more tension. Take a piece of cordage and tie to the next tie-out point from the front centre tie-out. Fold this piece of loose tarp back on itself and tie it off at the back corner peg. I use an adjustable guy line hitch to do this, which you can see in more detail in my tarp setup video in the description box below. Do exactly the same to the opposite side. Finally, you can add a guy line to the front centre of the tarp to tie out the entrance and help shed the rain away from the entrance of your shelter. Now you have a low profile tarp tent, which I find works well in strong winds as it has a number of angles to it. I find it tends to deflect the wind away from the shelter rather than act like a sail and catch the wind. The entrance at the front is tight, but it leaves a big enough gap for airflow, yet small enough that you're well sheltered from strong winds than you would be with an open tarp. There is a surprising amount of space inside the shelter. The great thing about this is that if you are camping in open ground and you prefer to carry a tarp in your kit as opposed to a tent, you can use an adjustable hiking pole to maintain the tension of the tent and set it to the height that you prefer. The lower the roof, the wider the space inside. The higher the roof, the narrower the space inside. Some people might be asking, why not just take a tent for a shelter instead of a tarp? Well, the answer is personal preference. A tarp is far smaller when packed down. You don't need any tent poles, which might fail on you, and you can make a vast array of different shelters from just one tarp. Whereas a tent, you are stuck with the same footprint regardless. Both have their place. The next shelter is for hammock campers. You only need to use the 4 tie-up points at the corners of the square tarp. First, find 2 trees that are just a bit wider than the width of your tarp. Tie one corner of the tarp to the tree. Now, there are a number of knots that you can use to tie a tarp to a tree. I tend to use a Siberian hitch. If you want to learn how to tie it, I recommend watching my tarp setup video in the description box below. Once you have tied the knot, grab the other corner of the tarp and tie this off to the opposite tree. Note that I am tying opposite ends of my tarp so that it is set up in a diagonal pattern. Once your tarp is secured in between the trees, you should have just 2 guy lines remaining. Grab these and peg the tarp out so that it is tight. Again, I use an adjustable guy line hitch so that I can adjust the tension of the tarp if the wind and rain make the tarp sag over time. Then head on over to the opposite side and do the same there. If the winds are strong, then don't use too much guy line. Just peg the tarp down as low as possible so that you are well sheltered from the wind. And that's it. With the 2 guy lines pegged out, you've set up a diamond fly tarp. All you need to do now is string your hammock in between the trees. The great thing about this setup is not only is it great in strong winds, but you can also adapt it to make it much more spacious when the weather has calmed down. All you need to do is undo one of the side guy lines, and this time take it further out to the side and tie it to a tree about head height. The other side should be the one that is protecting you from the wind. Meanwhile, you now have an open view of the forest, as well as the opportunity to have a fire underneath the tarp, providing that you have strung it high enough so that the sparks won't burn holes in it. If the storm has passed and there is little to no wind, then you can unpeg the other side and open it up to have a much wider area protected from above, and it allows you to have a 360-degree view of the surrounding woodland. Should the wind pick up again, you can just take the guy lines and tie them down as close as possible to the centre of the shelter to give you that added protection from the sides again. You'll notice that with this shelter setup, I don't have a specific ridgeline running through the loops in my tarp with prusik loops. This is because all I generally need is 4 guy lines on each corner of a tarp, and I have far more versatility for quicker tarp setups than I would with a pre-tied ridgeline. A simple, cheap monocular can help you identify good camping areas way ahead of you. You can clip them to your backpack so you can use it on the move, and it's so compact that it wouldn't take up much room in your pack. Using some vegetation as a backdrop, you can scout the area ahead to look for ideal locations to stealth camp, or check the movements of any people nearby. This particular one comes with a carry case, so you can attach it to your belt if you would prefer. When setting up a shelter, be it a tent, tarp, or even making a natural shelter, it needs to ideally be low profile and fast to set up. A small, lightweight tarp like this 2.9 by 3 meter tarp is ideal for most situations. A tarp is much more versatile than a tent and can often be quicker to set up. One of the best low profile tarp setups is to lay your tarp flat down on the ground, preferably with bushes and small vegetation nearby. Peg out the 4 corners of the tarp so that it is quite tight. Then cut a small stick and place this underneath the front of the centre of the tarp. Now you have a low profile shelter, but it's still quite visible. Add some camo netting over the top of the tarp to help blur the sharp edges and make it blend in more with the surrounding woodland. Take this one step further by adding nearby debris, be it leaves or branches from dead vegetation. The camo netting traps the leaves and stops them falling off, allowing you to cover your entire shelter. Though you are generally more exposed when hammock camping, as you will likely have a tarp above your head, you can still take steps to aid you when stealth camping. Using a hammock sleeve like this one means that you can quickly deploy or pack away your hammock at speed should you need to bail and get back to your vehicle. Just slide the sleeve back over the hammock, detach it from the tree, and it will save you a lot of time when packing up. This particular hammock has a fly net attached to it. This means that I can set my hammock up between two trees like normal, but this time use it as a ground shelter by laying the hammock on the floor and then raising the fly net and tying it to a tree a few feet above the ground. To make the shelter blend in more, I can throw over some camo netting and leaves like in the previous shelter, and all of a sudden I have a quick deploy ground shelter as well as a hammock. Granted, I would still need a tarp above my head if it were to rain, but something small and compact like the tarp used earlier would be easy enough to set up. If I wanted to be bold and build a shelter from natural materials, I often look for areas of woodland where there is already likely to be a fallen tree or plenty of materials to build with. This saves on half of the building time needed to make a shelter. For example, this tree root here offers full protection from one side. I only need to build 2 walls either side and make a raised bed so that if it rains I wouldn't be sitting in water, and then build a roof on top and provide some cover with any leaves or debris nearby. Be wary of any tree roots that look unstable, as some might collapse forward onto your shelter. As with any shelter, when stealth camping it's good to keep it minimum and low profile. Here's one I built by attaching some bin bags to a few sticks that I bent over to form a tunnel. I then broke up the outline of the shelter by using some leaves from a nearby bush. You'll notice that although the shelter blends in well, the ends of the cut wood are pretty white and still stand out. You can mask these by simply rubbing some mud over the cut ends, like in this example here. If you need to head further away from camp to collect water or gather more resources, and you are worried about someone finding your gear, you can place your pack in a bush and throw over some camo netting to keep it well hidden. The most efficient way to boil and cook food when camping is likely to be a gas stove. However, as efficient as these are at boiling water, they tend to be pretty loud. The most discreet way of boiling water would be a meths burning stove or alcohol burner. I keep a full cook kit in this camo case. It houses my stove, cook cup and drinking cup all in one compact carry bag which has molly webbing on the back to attach it to the outside of my bag should I need to. I pour the methylated spirit into the Trangia burner and light it. You can see that it burns with an almost invisible flame. I fold over the pot stand and place my pot of water on top and add the lid. Now I leave that to boil whilst I finish setting up camp. The great thing about this type of fuel burner is that it makes no noise whilst boiling the water, and it doesn't give off any smell like a campfire would. It takes a few more minutes to boil water than a gas stove would, but it's a hell of a lot quieter and ideal for stealth camping. Another, more compact stealth cooker is a folding hexi stove. These often come in military MRE ration packs. Essentially, it's a flat piece of metal that you fold into a small stove. Then you light the hexamine heating tablets that come with the stove and place your pot on top. This is another really compact way of cooking food and boiling water, as well as giving off very little smoke and noise. If you find that you need to make a fire for warmth, then the best option would be to dig a Dakota fire pit. This is essentially one hole about 12 inches deep and then another smaller hole next to it about the same depth. Then use a stick to create a hole or tunnel between these two holes. Now make your fire in the larger hole and the smaller hole acts as a wind tunnel to keep air and oxygen supplying your fire. Now you have a discreet fire that hides the flames well and allows you to cook food or boil water. However, this doesn't stop the fact that your fire might produce lots of smoke, which could be a huge giveaway when stealth camping. To prevent this, it's important that you only burn dead, dry wood. The drier the better. Here are 2 fire lays. The one on the left has dry wood, and the one on the right has damp, wet wood. Both burn fairly well to begin with,
because I lit them both with a strong firelighter. However, after a few minutes the fire on the right is struggling to produce enough heat to burn efficiently. If I go to add small twigs that are still green and damp, you will see that it instantly starts to smoke. Now, even if the fire on the left is burning well, if I add wet wood to that, it will start to smoke too. And now you can see that after just a few seconds of adding wet wood, there is smoke billowing from the fire. This is now a massive giveaway of my location, and I would be visible even from many kilometres away. So ideally, try and find dead dry wood that is hanging up in tree branches and off the ground. If comfort is your thing and you don't wish to be cramped inside a small bivvy bag or tarp, then a standard 2-person tent works just as well, providing you don't set it up in open ground that is easily visible. I normally opt for a tent that has a dark inner tent and dark olive green or brown outer fly sheet. The reason being is that some lightweight tents have a brighter inner tent and lightweight fly sheet. These are generally made with thin material in order to be lightweight. However, the cost of having this lighter material means that at night, when you are inside your tent with a head torch or light on, your tent will light up much more and therefore be more visible in the dark. The tents that have thick inner linings and outer fly sheets cut down the light given off by your head torch when inside and reduce the chance of your tent being spotted in the distance. If you need to make a quick getaway and break down camp fast, the large dry sack is an ideal piece of kit to have inside your pack. When rolled up, it takes up very little space, but when you need to get a wet tent or tarp packed away quickly, you can just shove it inside your dry bag and head off. This saves a lot on time and hassle of trying to roll it up inside its own carry sack. A simple Sialoom glow stick can be really handy at night. It doesn't give off as much light as an LED head torch would, and if the batteries ran out on your head torch, then you have a backup light source if needed. They can be useful when trying to navigate without a light source. Another backup navigation option is to have a GPS watch. Many modern GPS watches have a tracking option, and you can set this to track you as you head out into the woods to find camp. Then, if you need to navigate back to your vehicle in the dark, you can use the GPS tracker on your watch to find your way back. I wouldn't solely rely on this for navigation, but it is a great backup option to have.
Rather than push the knife down on the wood, is actually just use the wood itself. So being careful not to have your fingers slide down the blade, so have your thumb on the top of the blade. Just put it into a log like that, bury it, and then just hold it. Split this piece in half to make it a bit easier. And this time, rather than using my knife, I'm actually just going to use the stick itself and pull it against the bevel. And this is a much more controlled method. It's much safer because the blade is in front of my hand, so it's well out of the way. And you just do fine movements to find the right depth of the bevel of your knife, and do it slowly to begin with because you want to be able to find what works with your knife. And then you can always get finer as you go, but you barely need to touch the bevel of your knife to get these curls going. So try and keep the wood as flush and flat to the blade as possible, and then barely tilt the blade in, and you get some really nice thin kind of long curls doing it this way. Now, the Bushcraft knife is not necessarily the only tool that you'll have with you in your pack. A lot of you guys, me included, will carry a small hatchet or an axe. This also has a sharp bevel, and it can be used in a similar fashion to make feather sticks. Make sure that the heel part of it, this part, is sticking out. So here's my log. I've buried that in the log, and I've left a part of the bit exposed just here. In a similar fashion to the knife, you're just pulling this stick against the bevel of your axe, and I find it's almost easier to make a feather stick with an axe than the sharper bevel of a knife, just due to the grind really. So let's give it a go. I'm also holding my axe higher up here just for a bit of support. Again, it takes a while to find the bevel, but once you do, you can make some really nice curls. I prefer making curls with an axe. Sorry, there's an airplane going over. Just because of that kind of convex grind, but with a nice big bevel on it, big cheeks. So again, I'll change camera angle in a minute, but I'm just going up and back, up and back. Fine these curls are with just an axe. You know, these are really good, fine curls for getting a fire going and exposing that dry inner wood. So you can see the principle of how I'm moving the wood and just rotating it when I want to put some feathers on the other side of the wood where it's getting too bunched up and thick on one side. Y-shaped stick. All I'm going to do I've sawn it off the main branch here, and all I'm going to do is where this main trunk comes and meets the fork of the Y, I'm just going to saw there, like that. So now the trunk of the stick, the main branch, is gone, and I'm just left with the Y shape there, which is now a V. So about 3 inches from the main stick, I'm going to cut something a bit off here, like that. And then I'm going to go down probably 12 inches or so and just cut it off there. All of a sudden, that Y-shaped stick now looks like this. It's the stick up like this, so that the point is facing upwards. I'm going to turn this to you so you can see. And then just here, I'm going to make an X. So I put my knife diagonally there, use another stick to batten it, hit it down gently, just so it bites into the wood a bit. So I've made a diagonal cut, and I'm going to make another diagonal cut. So I've done a line there and a line there. So with the smaller point of the stick facing me, I'm then going to move material diagonally on the X. So I'll zoom in a bit. So there's one cut at that angle. I'm now going to match that angle, come back about 1 inch, and just slice away some wood, just like that. A couple of times, and now I can see where my stop cut was, which is this. This is called a stop cut, and then this is a slice cut. Slicing. So I'm just removing some of that material away, then coming in here where I made the original X for the stop cut, and moving that material. Now I'm going to do the same to the other side. So turn it round, come up and meet that diagonal point that I originally made for that X. So you can see that's the depth of my notch at the moment. If I go much deeper than that, I'm going to weaken this part of the wood. It's going to be quite weak. So that should be enough. And then now from just that Y-shaped stick, I've made myself a pot hanger that can hang over the fire. Imagine this is a spit hanging over the fire. Here's my Y-shaped stick. Okay, I can hook this whichever way over the fire I want. But the most important thing is that notch there can hook my kettle, can now hook onto that notch like that. It's a bit precarious at the moment, that one, but it hooks on that notch. And now I can hang my kettle over the fire. Now obviously this is a bit short, so it would hang like that, and that's how it would work. I tend to try and not waste these pot hangers, because what you could do, they're multi-use, is you could tie some cordage to a tree, pull it tight, so put the cord around the notch itself, pull it really, really tight. I've just done an arbor knot here because they don't tend to slip. I can double it over, go round the notch, tie it off at the back, and then with that secure, this can take a lot of weight, this fork. And now, even with this big backpack, which is loaded with gear, I can just hang it from that notch. My backpack is dry, it's off the ground, it's easy to get things in and out of the pack without having to lean over, bending down on the ground. Nothing gets wet. Really simple, multi-use. That's what you can do with a small Y-shaped stick. But if you get some larger Y-shaped sticks like this one's slightly different in that I'm making sure that the Y is coming out kind of evenly to the main trunk, but they're thicker. They're about the thickness of my wrist, really, a little bit thicker. And then if I put some points on the end with an axe, so now 2 Y sticks and some stakes, just hit them into the ground, and you can knock in between the Y here. It's really strong generally, it's really tough if it's not too rotten, but just knock those in. So now with my 2 Y-shaped sticks in the ground and a straight stick, over that I've made a spit for the fire, and then I can use my second Y-shaped stick to hang that from the horizontal beam, build my fire down the bottom, and then hang my kettle. And within probably 15 minutes or so, I have a hole. Just to show you in close up, with the first 2, I'm just going to interlock them like that and lean them together. The third one is going to hook in underneath both those 2 to form a tripod that will self-support itself. It will support itself. They don't have to be straight. And then the third one supports both those 2. And then what you want to do is just push down on the middle to check that it's rigid. That's now not going anywhere. I have a tripod. Now all I do is just wrap a piece of cordage around like so. Keep it simple. I can loop it round so that it's actually going to go down the middle of the tripod like that. So what I do is I loop it on itself like that. Hopefully you can see that. Then I fold that loop up above, pinch and pull so that it's like a loop through a loop. Grab a small stick, wiggle that through, and then pull tight. And now that's not going to move anywhere when I pull on it. From here I can get my kettle and just push the stick right through, push it through there, make sure it's central, and that stick is now holding up my kettle. So there you can see 3 forked sticks or Y-shaped sticks, some cordage that goes down to a kettle, and then to adjust the tripod,
the height of the kettle, all I do is just widen the tripod legs. You can make an adjustable marlin spike, but I just widen the tripod or bring the legs closer to raise it over the fire. So another thing you could do is tie an overhand loop in your cordage, and that stick that you were using earlier on the kind of spit, you get the pot hanger, you can actually just loop this through the loop like that, and it will swing with the weight of the kettle at the bottom. It won't rock like that, and it will swing really well. There's the notch that I made earlier, and the kettle hangs absolutely fine from the stick. The benefit of this method, using the pot hanger, is that the heat from the fire won't burn your cordage as much. You don't run the risk of your cordage or your string that you're using snapping, because too much heat from the fire, if you're using the wrong type of string, or just paracord or anything in general, eventually it will start to weaken with the heat, and it will create a weak point and snap. Whereas with a stick like this, you're keeping that string a lot higher from the heat of the fire. When trying to keep it simple, looking for tinder material to make a tinder bundle or a bird's nest type thing to light a fire. When you open your eyes to natural materials that are dead, dry, and can be made fluffy or fluffed up into a bird's nest, you will suddenly realise there is actually quite a wide variety of natural materials that you can use for lighting fire. For example, here behind me, there's just lots of green bracken. And whilst green, like this bracken is useless for lighting a fire, it's just going to smoke. But when it's dead and died back, like this one here, you've only got to snap off a few of these dry branches, like so. Just one bit of bracken there, and then bunch it up into a ball, make a little bird's nest, and I could put an ember in there, or I could do this. There you go. Very flash tindery, but it can get you a fire going. And it's not just bracken or dead material like that. It could be grass, the inner bark of cedar tree, which can be peeled off, buffed up in your hands and made into a tinder bundle, and that can take a spark as well. We've also got the honeysuckle vine, the bark of the honeysuckle vine. Again, you can peel that off, fluff it up into your fingers, rub it together in your hands, keep it dry in your pocket even, and then throw some sparks on it from a ferro rod, and that can light it too. You'd be amazed at the type of materials that you can use to get fires lit. Something else that I found really useful to me is the value of green, so with the leaves on, bendy sticks, twigs, small saplings, the bushcraft uses you can get from small, thin, bendy sticks is just incredible. You've got things like a spring pole snare, which I've shown in a previous episode, you know, using the bendiness of a sapling that's growing, making multiple components from the trap from the same sapling, setting up a snare with a trigger system that can then be launched as the mammal or the bird takes the bait. And it's incredible that just a small green stick can do something like that. The other thing you can do is things like I've done recently where I've made a fish trap and you weave, it could be hazel or willow or any small thin sapling in and out of some vertical uprights, and you can create a fish trap. In relation to that, you can also weave baskets. I've made some baskets from the clematis vine, just pulling the vine down from the tree and making a small spider-like structure, and then weaving smaller vines in and out of the spokes of the basket itself. It's a bit rudimentary, it's a bit crude, but it works and it's practical. And I've just felt that over the years, I've gained so much bushcraft experience from working with thin green mid saplings, vines, you know, anything that's flexible and bendy and thin. It's pretty incredible what you can actually make in the kind of bushcraft world.